The moment I opened that report, I knew the land I grew up on was carrying a truth my family had refused to face. That sentence kept repeating itself in my mind the morning everything changed, when the quiet routine of our house was interrupted not by noise, but by realization. Where I live, land isn't just dirt. It's inheritance. It's identity. It's the story your parents expect you to carry without question. And for most of my life, I did. I trusted the familiar shape of our property lines, the old fence that leaned just slightly, the way my father's footsteps sounded on the porch every evening, as if he were checking not the house, but the ground beneath it. But the day the environmental report arrived, that familiarity cracked. Numbers don't lie, especially not the ones printed in bold marked "exceeds threshold." And when the truth is scientific, stamped, and undeniable, it doesn't whisper. It lands with weight. Suddenly, my childhood home wasn't just home. It was a liability. And the man who raised me, the one who taught me to read the sky before rain, wanted to sell the land without disclosing the contamination buried under it. The story begins in that exact tension, between truth and denial, between duty and consequence, between the ground we inherit and the ground we choose to stand on. If you've ever faced a moment where doing the right thing meant standing alone, even against the people you love, this story will feel painfully familiar. Stay with me. There's a road ahead and every step matters. And before we dive deeper into the journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of this unfolding truth. My father slid the authorization papers across the wooden desk, as if pushing a quiet verdict. The edge of the top sheet hung just slightly off the surface, catching the afternoon light. He didn't blink. Not once. "Sign it this week," he said. The words clipped, already pre-decided. The room felt strangely airless, the kind of stillness that comes only when two people already know this conversation won't end where it begins. The smell of printer ink lingered, sharp, metallic, like the scent of something too new and too final. I kept my hands folded. I didn't touch the papers. They looked warm, as though his palms had left heat on them. But I wasn't ready to take that warmth or the weight attached to it. Instead, I opened my notebook and began recording his exact phrasing. The pen moved with a steady rhythm, almost indifferent. 8:12 p.m., I marked at the top of the page. The timestamp a simple boundary between what I felt and what I needed to document. My father's jaw twitched. He wasn't accustomed to being transcribed. "This is a family decision," he added. I noted that too, verbatim, letting the ink dry in a thin, controlled line. If emotions were going to interfere, I wanted them interfered with by facts. His gaze tightened. My pen didn't hesitate. When I finally looked up, I reminded him, carefully, calmly, that this land was my grandfather's. "He left it to us," I said. "It's not just property." My father waved the sentiment away as if brushing dust off his sleeve. "Don't get sentimental," he snapped. The air thinned again. Outside, a branch scraped gently against the siding, a quiet tug of sound that grounded me more than his words did. I kept my shoulders level, refusing the bait of the argument. Nostalgia wasn't the point, but neither was dismissing history because it was inconvenient. So I chose a different angle. "I'll review a few things tonight," I said evenly, "and I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Facts, not feelings." That was the only strategy that made sense. He looked unconvinced, but the directness bought me space. Thin space, but space nonetheless. I closed my notebook with a soft thud, enough to signal the end of the round without challenging him to another. The wood grain beneath my fingertips felt cool, steadying, almost like a pulse I could sync to. The papers still sat between us, untouched, waiting. Behind him, the shelf held a stack of folders, common, unremarkable, slightly bowed from years of use. One of them, the beige one with the faint crease, caught my eye. Land, evidence, year. the label I'd made weeks earlier. It wasn't dramatic or symbolic then, just organized preparation. Now it felt like a quiet witness. I reached up, sliding it out just enough to confirm the tab. My father didn't ask what I was doing. He assumed compliance was inevitable. But the folder's presence steadied me. Information had a way of softening power, at least redistributing it. My father tapped his pen 3 times against the desk, sharp, evenly spaced, decisive. Then he stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It lodged itself between us like a marker, like something had just crossed an invisible threshold. I closed my notebook slowly. Whatever this was, it had officially begun. The photograph of my grandfather sat on the top shelf, its wooden frame worn down at the corners where time had rubbed it smooth. He stood in his faded work shirt, the same one he used when tending the garden behind the first house he built. A thin layer of dust clung to the frame. I brushed it away with the back of my hand, the motion slow, almost ceremonial. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dry wood, like a place trying to hold on to its own history. Light from the window pooled around the photo, soft and amber, catching the edge of his smile, quiet, sure, unassuming. It reminded me that he had always treated land as something more than acreage or profit. He treated it like a promise. I remembered the field as it used to be, an open stretch where I once ran barefoot with a paper kite stitched together by my grandfather's careful hands. The grass had been uneven, patchy in some parts, but he said that honest land never pretended to be perfect. Good soil keeps a person straight, he once told me, kneeling beside me as he knotted a new length of string. The wind that afternoon had been gentle, the clouds broken like scattered chalk. My grandfather's laughter rose with the kite, a sound so light it barely touched the air. Now the memory pressed quietly at the edges of the present, reminding me what was worth protecting. I pulled out the old parcel maps I'd stored in the second drawer, yellowed, creased, bearing the folds of decades. I spread them over the desk, smoothing the corners until they lay flat again. The property boundaries traced a familiar shape, like the outline of something I used to know by heart. The lines were precise, the annotations in fading ink barely legible. I traced the roots with my finger, the paper cool under my skin, searching for anything I might have missed before. History wasn't only in memories. Sometimes it hid in documents people stopped paying attention to. I lifted my phone, photographing each section of the map, making sure the timestamps populated properly in the corner. 8:37 p.m. I saved them to 2 cloud folders, one private, one mirrored, letting the digital chirp confirm the upload. The house was quiet in the way a place becomes when it's waiting for a decision, its walls absorbing every soft sound. I flipped to the back of the map where a faint annotation, nearly invisible, ran along the edge. I captured that, too. The facts were gathering in small, steady increments, and with each one, the situation grew less about emotion and more about clarity. My father's footsteps crossed the hallway once, paused outside the doorway, then faded. I didn't look up. Direct confrontation rarely served either of us. Strategy mattered more. Observe first, respond second. I kept my breathing slow, letting the familiar hum of the house settle around me. Arguments could be deferred, data could not. I tucked the maps back into their folder, aligning the edges with an odd sense of relief. Some truths arrived loud, others required patience. I knew which kind I was dealing with tonight. Before bed, I set an alarm for 6:30 a.m., the earliest moment the county office would pick up the phone. The screen glow brushed against my face, pale and steady. I slid the phone onto the nightstand and lay still, listening to the soft tick of the clock. The night felt thin, fragile, as if one wrong breath could tear it open. I exhaled carefully, letting my thoughts settle into their compartments. Morning would bring answers, or at least the beginning of them. By mid-morning, I was surrounded by an uneven stack of documents. County printouts, archived permit summaries, stray receipts that had outlived their original purpose. One sheet in particular stopped me. A scribbled note about a decommissioned chemical plant 3 miles from the property line. The ink had faded into a weak gray, the kind that bleeds when humidity lingers too long. I held the paper up to the light, tilting it until the handwriting sharpened enough to read. Decommissioned, year pending review, it said, followed by initials that didn't match anyone in the current office. The room felt colder as I reread it. The air from the vent brushed across my wrists like a warning. My breath thinned just slightly. This wasn't the kind of detail my father would have bothered to remember. It wasn't the kind that made a sale easier, but it was exactly the kind that mattered. I drafted a request to the environmental records clerk, the kind of email that had to sound both polite and insistent. Please send the full PDF of historical permits associated with parcel ID, I typed, double-checking the language for clarity. I copied the file number from the map I'd photographed the night before, pasting it into the subject line where it couldn't be missed. The keys clicked steadily under my fingers, a small, grounding rhythm. When I hit send, my reflection flickered in the laptop screen. Tired eyes, slightly tightened jaw. A version of myself I recognized from other long nights spent sifting through truth the slow way. The cursor blinked like a pulse as the message transferred, and I felt that quiet shift inside me. The sense that one more piece was now officially in motion. I opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it with clinical precision, B-plot docs. Inside, I began placing everything that didn't directly relate to the sale but seemed too suspicious to ignore. Old tax summaries, utility reports from years the property wasn't actively used, a receipt for soil delivery that didn't match the land's condition. Individually, they said nothing. Together, they felt like a murmur forming at the edge of understanding. I ran my thumb along the ridge of a paperclip, the cool metal grounding me while I sorted file after file. Creating order out of chaos didn't always produce answers, but it made the silence easier to bear. And silence, I'd learned, often hid the most important things. I dialed the number printed on the corner of the annotated map, pressing the phone to my ear as the first ring cut through the quiet. A man answered, his voice deep, steady, practiced. "I'm trying to verify historic activity on the parcel adjacent to the former plant," I said, keeping my tone measured. He put me on hold. The static fuzzed low, like a tired radio left running. When he returned, his answer was cautious, deliberate. "Operations ceased years ago, but records weren't fully transferred. Some gaps. Gaps. The kind that made my father's urgency uncomfortable." I thanked him, wrote down his phrasing word for word, and let the line go dead between us. The house felt even quieter afterward. I pulled a fresh sheet from my notebook and wrote 3 possible contamination risks at the top. Heavy metals, solvents, underground leakage. The tip of my pen scratched lightly across the page, the sound soft but insistent. Theories weren't proof, but proof often started with theories no one wanted to state aloud. I circled each risk, leaving enough white space between them to breathe, then leaned back in my chair. For a brief second, I let myself close my eyes. If even one of these possibilities was real, the land wasn't just complicated, it was compromised. And compromised land didn't get sold without consequences. The plan that emerged wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. If the paperwork pointed towards something buried, I needed confirmation from someone whose job was to uncover what people preferred to overlook. A private environmental assessment, quiet, independent, separate from the county. I wrote the name of a reputable firm, then underlined it twice. The fibers of the paper bent slightly under the pressure, reminding me how thin the distance was between certainty and doubt. I set the pen down and inhaled slowly. By tonight, I would make the call that would either settle everything or open a door my father hoped would stay closed. I found my father in the dining room, hunched over his phone, the late afternoon glow throwing long shadows across the table. I stood in the doorway for a moment, steadying my breath before speaking. "Did you ever get an environmental assessment done on the land?" I asked. My voice was level, stripped of anything he could call emotional. He looked up slowly, eyebrows raised as though I'd asked something absurd. "Waste of money," he said, dismissing it with a quick flick of his hand. "That land's been fine for decades." His confidence felt too smooth, too prepared. I pulled out a chair but didn't sit. The wood creaked faintly under my hand, a thin, protesting sound, almost like the room itself didn't approve of the discussion we were about to have. He kept staring, waiting for me to drop the question the way he had. I didn't. He switched tactics quickly, talking about market timing, rising property values, and buyers who knew the worth of land when they saw it. His voice gained speed, fast enough to suggest he'd rehearsed this part. I watched the reflection of his movement ripple faintly across the surface of a glass left on the table, the water inside quivering with each emphatic gesture. "The price won't stay this high," he warned. "We need to move while the window's open." The urgency in him felt out of place, sharper than necessary. He wasn't trying to convince me of the land's value. He was trying to convince me not to look any deeper. The air tightened slightly, as if the walls understood the subtext even before I fully did. "I'm not signing anything until I have independent data," I said. The sentence left my mouth clean and steady, each word fitting into place without hesitation. He leaned back, folding his arms, the chair groaning beneath the shift of weight. "You're overcomplicating what should be simple," he shot back. But simplicity had its cost, and I'd learned long ago that my father preferred quick solutions to thorough ones. I kept my stance neutral, refusing to let the tension drag me into raised voices or fractured explanations. Emotions blurred facts. I couldn't afford that. He drummed his fingers on the table, the dull rhythm echoing faintly through the room, as if he were counting down the seconds of his patience. "There's a buyer," he insisted, holding up his phone as though the glowing screen validated everything. "Cash offer, immediate closing, no contingencies." A little too perfect. I leaned in just enough to see the first line of the message, then stepped back. "Fast deals usually favor the one who rushes," I said quietly. He frowned, but I could feel the moment teetering, his need for speed crashing into my need for accuracy. His thumb hovered over the screen, the blue light casting a cold sheen on his knuckles. The room seemed to shrink around us, compressing into the narrow space where his urgency met my refusal. Neither of us blinked. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the pause. "Can I see that?" I asked, gesturing toward the message. He hesitated, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected, before handing the phone over. I took a photo of the screen, capturing the date, the number, the exact phrasing. Then I emailed it to myself with a simple subject line: record. No commentary, no interpretation. Just another fact logged for later. My father's gaze hardened as I typed, the corner of his mouth tightening in a way that meant he felt control slipping grain by grain. I handed the phone back gently, as if the calmness of the gesture could soften what he saw as defiance. It didn't. He stood abruptly, the legs of the chair scraping across the floor with a harsh, metal-edged shriek. The sound sliced through the room, leaving a sharp quiet in its wake. He didn't say another word. He just stared for a moment, jaw clenched, then walked past me without looking back. I remained still, letting the silence settle, letting the facts settle with it. Whatever line we'd approached, whatever threshold this moment represented, we had crossed it, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. I made 2 calls that evening, both to companies whose names rarely appeared anywhere except on technical reports and invoices no one read unless they had to. The first receptionist transferred me to a project manager who spoke in clipped, clear sentences. The second connected me to someone who preferred email but answered my questions anyway. By the time I compared their timelines and credentials, the decision was clear. One firm could deliver results within 48 hours, quietly, directly, without involving the county unless something mandated it. "I'll need the contract under my name," I said. "That's standard," the project manager replied. The air around me felt still, holding the gravity of what I was setting in motion. As I ended the call, I stared at the black screen of my phone, its reflection catching a thin line of light across my face. Commitment didn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it was just a breath held 1 second longer than usual. The firm asked for the parcel's coordinates, soil access points, and a copy of the property map. I pulled the files from my drawer, smoothing the creased edges before scanning each page. The printer hummed beside me, a steady mechanical sound that filled the otherwise quiet kitchen. I attached the digital images to an email, labeling them with strict clarity, no shorthand, no ambiguity. When I hit send, the soft whoosh of the outgoing message felt strangely final, as if some boundary I didn't fully understand had just shifted. I checked each attachment twice, confirming the resolution, the legibility, the timestamps. Accuracy mattered. Not for drama, for protection. The invoice arrived minutes later, a single page with a line item that made me tense my jaw before I clicked pay. I captured a screenshot of the confirmation, date, time, transaction ID, and stored it in a separate folder. As the digital receipt settled into my inbox, I felt the weight of responsibility land somewhere near my sternum. Not fear exactly, just the awareness that once money moved, intentions became harder to take back. The room felt warmer suddenly, as if the overhead light had shifted color. I exhaled slowly and placed the printed confirmation into the growing stack on my desk. Evidence wasn't just about uncovering what others hid. It was also about documenting every choice I made. Before sending the final authorization, I added one more line to the agreement. No disclosure of findings without my written consent. I typed it carefully, letting each word settle into place before moving on. The firm replied with a brief acknowledgement, attaching their own signature. The clean click of my mouse as I countersigned echoed faintly in the room, a small but decisive sound. I sat back, letting my eyes rest on the screen's glow. Control didn't always mean winning. Sometimes it meant ensuring no one else could move faster than the truth. Outside, a car passed, headlights drifting across the wall like a silent reminder that the world kept moving, unaware of the pressure inside this small, dimly lit room. My father texted me just as I began organizing the new documents. "What did you decide?" I stared at the message for a long moment, the screen lighting my hands in cool, soft blue. "I'm checking a few procedures," I typed back. Nothing more. Nothing he could confront directly. His reply didn't come. I set the phone face down on the table, hearing the faint tap as it touched the wood. Distance wasn't always silence. Sometimes it was calculation. And sometimes it was the only way to keep a fragile piece from breaking too soon. Before going to bed, I wrote a note in block letters and taped it above my desk. "Don't sign. Wait for results." The paper fluttered slightly from the draft, sneaking in through the window frame, the edges lifting and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. I sat there for a moment, watching it move as the house settled into its nighttime quiet. A decision could feel solid in the mind and still waver under pressure. Seeing the reminder anchored me.
The night outside deepened, thick and still, as if holding its breath with me. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and I would meet it grounded, not rushed. The next morning, I cleared my desk until only essentials remained: the lamp, the small stack of active documents, and the sealed envelope containing the firm's instructions. The rest went into drawers, out of sight, leaving the room strangely bare.
The light from the lamp pooled across the wood in a soft amber oval, warming the surface, but leaving the corners of the room in quiet shadow. I skimmed the checklist I'd made the night before, each line waiting like a held breath. The silence in the house felt different these days, less like calm, more like anticipation. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the desk, feeling the slight vibration of the lamp's low hum, and reminded myself that waiting was part of the work. Still, the hours stretched thin, as if time resisted being lived through. I wrote out the steps for the next 48 hours: sample pickup, lab processing, preliminary report, document storage. I drew small squares beside each item, leaving them blank for now. The precision of the outline steadied me more than I expected. I could control the process at least. Outside, a breeze pressed against the windows, rattling them lightly before fading away, leaving only the faint whir of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the kitchen clock. I tapped my pen against the page, soft, rhythmic, then set it down. A plan didn't remove uncertainty, but it made the uncertainty less wild. Sometimes that was enough. At one point, I drafted a message to my father: "Fine, let's sell." My thumb hovered over the send button, but the words felt wrong, too fast, too surrendered. Too much like giving him what he wanted simply because I was tired. I erased the text in a slow drag of my finger, watching the letters disappear one by one. For a moment, I felt the tug of something familiar, the old instinct to smooth over tension, to keep peace at any cost. But peace without truth never lasted. I set the phone aside and let the weight of the unsent message settle. Choosing not to act could be its own form of strength. In the afternoon, I opened my laptop and pulled up the picture of my grandfather, the one I'd taken years ago during a stormy autumn evening. He stood near the porch steps, jacket zipped halfway, the wind ruffling his hair as he smiled at something just out of frame. I stared at it for several seconds, letting the memory slow my breathing. He had never raised his voice at me, not once. He believed in steady hands, measured steps, and the kind of integrity that didn't need to announce itself. Closing the photo made the room feel heavier, but clearer. Some decisions weren't about conflict or loyalty. Some were about honoring the people who taught us how to stand. As the day faded, I set an alarm for 8 a.m., the time the lab had promised, the earliest possible update. My finger lingered on the screen before pressing confirm, the digital click sounding louder than it should have in the dim room. The light outside had thinned into a muted blue, the kind that softened edges until everything looked a little unreal. I watched the shadows shift across the floor as the sun dipped lower, the house adjusting to night with its familiar creaks and settling breaths. Waiting wasn't passive, it was active restraint, an endurance of its own. When I finally lay down, my hand drifted toward the folder on the nightstand, fingertips brushing the cardboard edge. I didn't open it. I just kept my hand there, as if contact alone could anchor me through the restless hours ahead. The room was still, the kind of stillness that felt almost fragile. Sleep came in small fragments, thin, interrupted, my mind tracing the same quiet loop of questions. By dawn, I wasn't rested, but I was ready. The next message from the lab would tell me which direction the truth leaned, and whichever way it leaned, I would follow it. The notification arrived at 8:17 a.m., one soft vibration against the table, barely audible but unmistakable. I sat up straighter, pulse tightening as I opened the email. The report loaded slowly, a white page swelling into view before the numbers appeared. The first line stopped me. Heavy metal concentrations exceeding state limits by a factor of 5. I blinked, once, then again, forcing myself to stay steady as I scrolled. Each chart, each bar, each color-coded warning felt colder than the last. The air around me thinned, as if the room recognized what those numbers meant, even before I let myself feel it. I swallowed, the motion dry, mechanical. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was evidence. I sat back, letting the gravity of it settle across my shoulders. Not crushing, but undeniable. The truth had arrived, quiet and unembellished, and it wasn't leaving. I downloaded the PDF, saving it under 3 separate file names, each with its own timestamp. One on my desktop, one in the cloud, one on an external drive I rarely used except for things that mattered. The images of the soil samples came next, grainy photographs of dark earth sealed in clear containers, each tagged with coordinates and collection times. I organized them methodically, dragging them into folders lined up with almost militant precision. The digital chirp of each completed save echoed softly in the room. As I worked, I felt a faint tremor of purpose, as though clarity had rearranged something inside me. Not relief, just certainty. Certainty could be its own form of oxygen. I called the lead engineer, my voice steady even as my fingers curled slightly against the phone. "Can you walk me through the numbers?" He did, calmly, clinically, explaining thresholds, triggers, and the formal obligations that would follow this level of contamination. One phrase struck harder than the rest. This would initiate an official review. The phrase carried the weight of bureaucracy and consequence, a quiet verdict tucked inside a neutral sentence. I paced across the kitchen as he spoke, the floor cool beneath my bare feet. Through the window, sunlight hit the driveway in a pale stripe, bright but not warm. When the call ended, I stood still, letting the silence absorb the implications. The land wasn't just compromised. It was dangerous. I printed 3 hard copies of the report, watching each sheet glide forward from the machine with a faint crackle. The paper was warm when I gathered it, its edges slightly curled from the heat of the rollers. I clipped the pages onto a sturdy folder, pressing the clamp down until it snapped shut. The sound felt definitive, like something that couldn't be taken back. I smoothed the cover once with my palm, grounding myself in the physicality of the evidence. Even if the digital world failed, the truth now existed in ink and fiber. That mattered more than I expected. Facts you can touch tend to hold their shape when emotions try to bend them. I wrote a 1-page summary in plain language, short sentences, no technical jargon, something my father couldn't dismiss as too complicated. I laid out the findings clearly, highlighting the thresholds violated and the obligations that followed. As I typed, the keys felt firmer beneath my fingers, like each stroke anchored me deeper into resolve. This wasn't about winning an argument with him. It was about leveling the ground between us, forcing the truth to stand where opinion had been. I printed the summary and placed it on top of the report, adjusting the alignment until it sat perfectly square. It needed to be simple. It needed to be undeniable. I exhaled once, slowly, before reaching for my coat. The folder felt heavier than it should have as I slid it under my arm, the weight settling against my ribs, like a reminder of the line I was choosing to cross. I locked the door behind me, the click sharp in the morning quiet. Outside, the air carried a faint chill, clean and thin, a stark contrast to the heaviness of what I was holding. I walked toward the truck, each step steady. Whatever came next would start with the truth I carried in my hands, and I was ready. My father was at the kitchen table when I walked in, elbows planted, eyes fixed on the muted television as if pretending to follow whatever morning news scrolled across it. I set the folder down in front of him with a quiet thud. Nothing dramatic, just enough weight to claim the space between us. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stared at the closed cover, as though the truth inside might spill out on its own if he waited long enough. "I think you should read this," I said. My voice was calm, steady, offering no room for misinterpretation. He exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp and irritated, but still didn't reach for the pages. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, the wood cool beneath my palms. The distance between us felt measured, controlled, deliberate. "Whatever that is," he said, nodding toward the folder, "you're blowing it out of proportion. Numbers don't mean much unless someone knows how to read them." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and slid the summary page toward him, the paper gliding across the table in a clean, straight line. "These numbers," I said softly, "are the ones the state uses to determine hazard levels." He glanced down, eyes skimming the bolded thresholds, the red markers that required no interpretation from any expert. For a moment, he looked almost lost, like the ground he relied on had shifted a degree beneath him. He cleared his throat, straightened his back, and forced a familiar defiance in the place. But the hesitation had already shown. His phone vibrated on the table, one short buzz. He turned it over. A message flashed across the screen from the agent. "Buyer ready to sign today. Need confirmation." The glow from the notification washed over his knuckles, highlighting the tension in the tendons as he gripped the device a little too tightly. I watched the light fade from the screen before speaking. "If we sell without disclosure," I said, "you could be liable. Legally. Financially." He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. He set the phone down slowly, aligning it with the table's edge, the way he did only when he was trying not to show uncertainty. The silence afterward felt stretched thin. I pointed to the chart in the report, the one showing contamination levels spiking well above the state limit. "These numbers aren't optional," I said. "They're obligations." He rubbed his temples, staring at the page like it personally offended him. "You think you understand every little thing," he muttered. I didn't rise to it. Facts weren't insulted by frustration. The refrigerator hummed behind us, steady and indifferent, filling the space his arguments used to occupy. "This isn't about what I understand," I answered. "It's about what's documented." His jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict me. Not this time. I forwarded the agent a brief message. "We are reviewing disclosure obligations." No accusations, no explanations. Just a sentence that locked the next steps into the realm of statute, not persuasion. I CC'd my legal inbox, letting the echo of documentation settle in my chest like a quiet anchor. My father watched the screen as I sent it, his expression narrowing into something between irritation and resignation. He didn't ask to read the report again. He didn't try to argue. He just sat back, folding his arms in a way that suggested he knew the momentum had shifted, but wasn't ready to admit how far. His silence felt different now. Not avoidance, recognition. The printer in the corner sputtered to life as it processed the copies I'd queued earlier, page after page sliding out with mechanical finality. The sound cut through the quiet, filling the room with a steady, cold rhythm. My father looked toward the noise, then back at the folder, as if the evidence was multiplying faster than he could resist it. I gathered the papers without comment, each sheet warm against my fingertips. When I stood, he didn't stop me. I walked out of the kitchen, the soft thud of the pages settling against my arm the only sound following me down the hallway. Whatever happened next, the truth was no longer something he could sidestep, and we both knew it. My father came to my doorway just after noon, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed.
a familiar posture meant to disguise agitation as authority. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. His voice reached for its usual sharpness, but strain cut through it, thinning the edges. I kept my notebook open on the desk and wrote his words exactly as he said them. He noticed. "You don't have to write every damn thing down." Still, he didn't leave. He lingered there, hoping guilt might pull me back into the easier version of myself, the one who bent instead of held. But guilt had no standing against written facts. He called me ungrateful, a word he'd always used when he wanted emotion to do the heavy lifting for logic. I kept my pen moving. It steadied me more than any breath could. He launched into a rehearsed argument about the buyer, the opportunity, the once-in-a-lifetime timing that shouldn't be wasted. His voice cracked near the end, not from age but from effort, like the strain of holding together a story that no longer supported itself. In the past, his desperation would have softened me. Now it only sharpened my focus. "The buyer needs the land now," he insisted, as if urgency alone could cleanse contamination. His eyes flicked toward the living room where the folder lay on the coffee table, its cover sealed, its truth unchanging. I didn't respond. Silence can be a boundary too, and that one held firm. When the arguments began looping back on themselves, I turned to the printer and gathered the documents I'd left there earlier. My summary, the lab results, the calibration sheet confirming instrument accuracy. "I'll send you a copy," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He didn't take the papers. Instead, he folded his hands tightly, the knuckles whitening under the tension. "Stop making this official," he muttered. But it already was. I returned to my desk and typed a concise email summarizing our conversation,
Attaching the documents and sending them to him with the subject line, "Current status." No emotion, just record keeping. I checked my watch, 3:11 p.m., then drafted a message to my attorney for a 3:30 consultation. The cursor blinked in steady intervals as I composed the request, each sentence short, factual, and pointed. By the time I hit send, the air in the room felt heavier, as if the consequences of each action thickened the space around me. I opened the window slightly, letting in a rush of cooler air. Outside, dry leaves brushed across the porch steps, their soft scraping almost soothing. Taking a step back from the noise inside my head felt necessary, even if only for a moment. Legal clarity wasn't comfort, but it was direction. Before the call, I organized the text messages from my father and the buyer's agent into a clean chronological chain. Dates, times, full phrasing, no gaps. I saved the thread as a PDF and backed it up in 3 places, then double-checked the formatting to ensure nothing cut off at the margins. The quiet precision calmed me. Order, once restored, gave complicated truths a place to settle. I leaned back in my chair, letting the faint hum of the computer fill the room. Some people sought relief in reassurance. I found mine in clean documentation. It was the only language that never shifted under pressure. As the clock approached 3:30, I allowed one question to surface, the one I'd been avoiding. If the land had been clean, would I have signed? Would I have handed it over simply because he wanted it done? I didn't write the answers down, I didn't need to. The quiet that followed carried them well enough. I stood when the phone rang, smoothing my shirt with one steady hand. Whatever came next would demand clarity, not sentiment, and I was prepared to meet it. The attorney joined the call right on time, her voice crisp and measured, the kind that cut cleanly through whatever fog a person tried to hide behind. I summarized the findings: the attempted sale, the lack of disclosure, and the pressure my father had applied. She listened without interrupting, the faint sound of her typing punctuating key details. When I finished, she spoke plainly. "You have legitimate grounds to refuse the sale, legally, ethically, procedurally." The clarity in her tone steadied something inside me. I leaned back in my chair,
letting the words settle. Outside, a lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance, the mundane hum oddly grounding. "You're not obstructing a transaction," she added. "You're preventing liability." The distinction mattered. It untangled years of learned guilt in a single clean line. She walked me through statutory disclosure requirements, each item sharp and uncompromising. If contamination is known, she said, selling without disclosure would constitute fraud. Buyer could sue. State could intervene. I wrote every phrase down, the ink forming neat, deliberate lines. Memorizing the risks helped shift the pressure from internal conflict to external obligation. This wasn't just about my father and me anymore. It was about legality, safety, truth. A gust of wind tapped against the window, the soft vibration aligning with her final words. "Your refusal is the only defensible position." When the call ended, the room felt clearer, as if the walls had leaned back and given me space to breathe. I opened a new document and drafted a formal letter to the buyer's agent. Each sentence was concise. "We cannot proceed under current conditions. Pending environmental remediation. Disclosure required by statute." No emotion, no debate, just structure. I reread the text twice, tightening language until it carried the cool precision the situation demanded. The printer clicked on, sending the letter sliding out one slow inch at a time. The paper was warm when I retrieved it, still carrying the faint chemical scent of toner. I scanned the signed copy and attached it to an email addressed to the agency.
My attorney CC'd. The act of sending it felt like stepping onto solid ground. I gathered the report, the summary, and the correspondence into a single folder, its weight firm, palpable. Holding it felt different now. Not like a burden, but like a shield. The edges of the folder brushed lightly against my wrist as I set it back on the desk, the sound muted but certain. For the first time in days, I felt aligned, my decisions matching the facts rather than the pressure. The legal path ahead might be slow, full of forms and verification, but it was straight. Straight mattered. Straight was something I could stand on. Before closing my laptop, I drafted a proposal outlining potential remediation steps: soil excavation, containment barriers, groundwater testing. It wasn't my responsibility to fix the contamination, but preparing options helped ground the next phase. "Offer alternatives, not conflict," my grandfather used to say. The memory brushed quietly through me as I typed the final lines. I printed the outline and placed it behind the main report, letting the pages fall into alignment with a faint, satisfying tap. Even difficult truth could come with direction. I was determined to show that. I signed the digital scans, dated every page, then backed them up in 3 separate locations. When I closed the laptop, the click echoed softly in the still room. The action marked the end of a chapter, not the whole conflict, but the legal pivot that would shape everything going forward. I rested my hand briefly on the cover of the folder, feeling its sturdy surface under my palm. This wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to move faster than the truth. And the truth had finally settled somewhere solid. The news moved through the family faster than I expected. Quiet whispers carried through group texts, side conversations. Assumptions sharpened into judgments before a single person asked for context. By early evening, I heard the familiar hum of disapproval settling around me, the kind that didn't announce itself directly, but existed in pauses, in clipped greetings, in the subtle way people looked away too quickly. "She's stopping her own father," someone said, not knowing I was in the next room. The words weren't loud, but they landed with precision. I didn't step in. Explaining myself to people who preferred conclusions over facts felt like pouring water into a sieve. Instead, I returned to my desk, opening the report again, even though I'd memorized every line. The numbers didn't judge me, they clarified me, and clarity felt steadier than approval. When a cousin messaged me with, "What's really going on?" I replied with the most neutral sentence I could, "See attached findings." I attached the summary and hit send. No long explanation, no justification. Facts belonged in daylight. Opinions could stay where they were, shifting, uncertain, unanchored. A few minutes later, the read receipt appeared. No reply followed. I didn't need one. Through the window, the sky dimmed into a muted gray, the kind that blurred edges and softened the shape of things. I let the quiet settle. Sometimes silence meant resistance. Sometimes silence meant understanding. Either way, it was out of my hands. On my way to the grocery store, I ran into a neighbor. He studied me with a polite curiosity, his gaze hovering somewhere between concern and a desire for gossip. "Everything all right with the property?" he asked. I kept my tone even. "We're reviewing some environmental concerns." He nodded slowly, the words sinking in deeper than he probably expected. "Safety first," he murmured. I could tell he wanted to ask more, but the quiet weight of the phrase seemed to hold him back. As I walked away, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. Truth had a way of reshaping even small conversations. Not dramatically, just enough to tilt the ground beneath assumptions. Back home, I made coffee and stood by the counter while it brewed, the rich scent filling the kitchen with a warmth the day had lacked. The house felt emptier than usual, not lonely, just quieter, as if every room understood the tension and had softened itself to make space for it. I set the mug on the table and sat down, letting the heat seep into my palms. In the silence, I replayed my father's expression from the day before. The way he looked at the report, then at me, as if trying to decide which version of reality he could live with. My chest tightened, not with regret. Both the ache of knowing truth and closeness didn't always coexist. For 2 days, my father said nothing. He moved through the house like someone navigating a familiar space in unfamiliar light, hesitant, withdrawn, avoiding the table where the report still lay. I didn't push him. We'd crossed into a territory where persuasion had no place. Late one afternoon, I walked past his door and heard him adjusting the blinds, the gentle clatter sounding oddly fragile. He used to fill silence with certainty. Now, silence filled him. Downstairs, I updated my checklist with the remaining steps. Community notice, state follow-up, remediation estimates. Structure steadied me. It gave the emotional distance somewhere to sit without consuming everything around it. Before bed, I added one more item to the checklist. Prepare for hearing. The words looked stark against the page, a reminder that the family tension was only one layer of a much larger landscape. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the report, the two covers touching lightly, like two truths leaning against each other. The house had settled into its nighttime rhythm, pipes cooling, wood contracting, the faint hum of appliances. I switched off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the room disappear into shadow. Sometimes, the quiet after conflict wasn't peace. Sometimes, it was simply the space where conviction learned to breathe. The community hall was smaller than I remembered. Low ceiling, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, the faint scent of old varnish lingering in the air. I stood near the front with my notes folded neatly in my hand, waiting for the quiet to settle. When the room finally grew still, I spoke. Just 5 lines. Only the essential facts. Contamination levels, the state threshold, the required procedures moving forward. I kept my voice steady, each word measured, offering no space for panic or for argument. A few people leaned forward, others crossed their arms, but no one interrupted. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead,
their pale glow flattening every expression into something restrained. Information changed a room differently than emotion. It didn't flare, it sank, and that sinking was palpable. A woman in the second row raised her hand. "Is there a way to fix it?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, just tired, like someone who had already lived through too many disappointments to add fear to the list. "Yes," I said, "but remediation takes time, and cooperation." The words landed gently but firmly. Another person asked about groundwater, someone else about the old plant. I answered each question with the same steady tone, keeping to what I knew, avoiding speculation. The room grew quieter with every exchange, not out of resignation, but clarity. They weren't looking for reassurance, they were looking for honesty. I gave them nothing else. I signed the attendance sheet and the minutes of the meeting, the pen scratching faintly across the paper. The official record would state exactly what had been said and what would follow. Afterward, the chair of the neighborhood association approached me. "You're doing what needs to be done," she said, her voice low. I nodded, tucking the signed papers into my folder. The hall's fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a flat glow across the empty chairs.
It felt less like a conclusion and more like a beginning, a shift from whispered rumors to documented truth. And truth, once spoken aloud, had a way of echoing in spaces long after people left them. My father stood near the back of the room. I hadn't seen him enter, but there he was, hands clasped behind him, lips pressed into a tight line. When the meeting ended, he stepped forward, not toward the exit, but toward me. "You're ruining the deal," he said. His voice held no volume, only accusation. I lowered my gaze to the papers in my hands, letting the weight of them anchor me. "This isn't about the deal," I replied. "It's about the facts." He looked past me toward the cluster of neighbors gathering their things, avoiding his eyes. For the first time I sensed something beneath his anger. Fear, maybe, or the slow collapse of something he had depended on. But I didn't push. Truth had already done enough pushing. A neighbor approached, asking whether I would share the full report. "Yes," I said. "Everything will be accessible through the environmental office once they complete their review." He thanked me, then slipped out through the side door with a soft shuffle of shoes. I packed my documents, sliding each page into its place, aligning the edges as carefully as if the order itself could hold the situation together. Facts had rhythm. Clear, steady, dependable. Opinion didn't. As I closed the folder, I felt that steady rhythm quiet the noise around me. Even when the tension grew dense, the structure remained. I stepped outside into the evening air, the door swinging shut behind me with a muted click. The sky was a deep gradient, blue thinning into gray, carrying the cool scent of dust and late light. I held the folder against my chest, feeling the faint warmth from where my hands had been. Inside the building, voices softened into indistinct murmurs before fading altogether. For a long moment, I stood on the steps and let the stillness settle. The drift between truth and consequence had begun. It would be slow, deliberate, but it would move. By morning, the story had reached the small local paper. The headline was measured, nothing sensational, but it named the contamination levels and referenced the environmental report. I read the article twice, noting how the journalist stuck closely to the documented facts, quoting the exact figures, avoiding speculation. It wasn't dramatic, but it was public. And once something becomes public, it stops belonging to private arguments. I closed the browser and sat back, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the low, steady anchor in an otherwise shifting day. My phone vibrated with a series of alerts, emails, messages, fragments of responses from people who had caught wind of the news before breakfast. Truth moved fast once given direction, and it rarely moved alone. Among the notifications was an email from an unfamiliar address offering to purchase the land as is at a noticeably reduced price. No greeting, no closing, just a number. I didn't respond. People who wanted bargains on damaged ground,
rarely wanted accountability with it. I archived the message, then blocked the address, letting the digital action mark a small but necessary boundary. Outside, the early sunlight stretched across the sidewalk in thin, pale strips, illuminating the dust on the window pane. The world kept going, indifferent to the upheaval inside my house. And maybe that was a kind of comfort. I reopened the summary I'd written, simplifying a few sentences so even those unfamiliar with environmental codes could understand the gravity without feeling overwhelmed. I added bold labels to the sections most neighbors asked about: groundwater, remediation steps, state requirements. Transparency wasn't just a legal position, it was practical compassion. People made better decisions when they weren't guessing. I saved the updated version, then printed fresh copies,
smelling the faint heat of the paper as it slid out of the machine. Making the truth easier to understand didn't change it. It only made it harder to ignore. Next, I assembled a series of links from the county website, the environmental agency's portal, and the archive documentation on the former plant. All objective, all public, all verifiable. I sent them to the neighbors who had reached out after the meeting, writing only, "Here are the official resources. Let me know if you need help reading any of them." No persuasion, no insistence, just tools. When people had access to information, fear took up less space. And in situations like this, reducing fear was as important as raising awareness. The inbox stayed quiet, but the read receipts pinged one by one. Midday, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, just a single sheet inside. "Thank you for not selling to us," it read. No signature, no details, just 12 words that carried the weight of someone else's relief. I stood on the porch for a long moment, the paper softening slightly in my hand as the warm breeze pressed against it. Anonymous gratitude was rare, and it meant someone had been close enough to worry, close enough to imagine themselves inheriting the consequences. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into the folder with the report. Some truths found unexpected witnesses. Later, I placed the envelope into a small box where I kept documents that didn't belong to any official category, things that carried emotional gravity rather than procedural weight. The click of the lid closing was soft, almost tender. The house was quiet again, sunlight drifting lazily across the floor in a long, thin band. For the first time since the testing began, I felt a subtle shift. Not victory, not ease, but acknowledgement. The truth had reached beyond my hands, into the community, into the records, into the quiet spaces where opinions recalibrated. I exhaled slowly. Whatever came next would meet less darkness than before. The email from the brokerage office arrived just after noon, its tone sharp beneath professional phrasing. They accused me of obstructing a lawful transaction and threatened to involve their legal department if I continued to interfere. I read the message once, then again, noting the vagueness of their claims, the kind designed to intimidate without substance. Without hesitation, I forwarded it to my attorney. She replied within minutes, her assessment precise. "They have no grounds. Their threat is empty. Do not engage further." The clarity steadied me. Still, the air in the room shifted, a faint tightening, as if the house sensed conflict pressing in. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle, then opened a new folder on my computer labeled simply Correspondence. Everything would be preserved. I would not be ambushed by words that weren't documented. My attorney drafted a formal response, citing disclosure laws, state precedent, and the brokerage's own contractual limitations. The email she sent on my behalf was quiet, cold, factual. Every sentence weighted with statute and case reference. Reading it felt like observing a scalpel cut clean through noise. "No further threat should be directed to my client," she concluded. I saved the message as a PDF, backing it up twice. Standing in the kitchen, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen, not because the conflict was over, but because the playing field had leveled. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, the faint vibration running through the floorboards, a reminder that the world still moved on its own steady track, unaffected by the legal standoffs unfolding inside this house. I gathered all the documents related to the attempted sale, emails, screenshots, the original message from the buyer. The stack had grown thicker than I realized. I clipped everything together and placed it into a labeled folder, Sale Attempt Documentation. Then I scanned the entire set, letting the machine's hum fill the silence with a kind of mechanical assurance. As each page digitized, I felt the narrative aligning, messy details becoming linear, emotional pressure becoming procedural clarity. Order was its own form of defense. By the time I slid the last page into the folder, I felt lighter. Not relieved, but fortified. There was a difference. I requested a 3-way call with my attorney and the brokerage, insisting everything occur on record. The phrase tended to disarm people who relied on implication rather than evidence. The brokerage agreed, though not gracefully. Before the call, I stood in the hallway outside my father's closed door, tapping once on the frame. "We're having a formal discussion about the sale," I said. He didn't answer. The silence behind the door was thick, but not unexpected. I waited a moment longer, then stepped away. Some absences were choices, and choices had meaning, even when unspoken. The call began with brittle politeness. My attorney led with the contamination report, walking through the findings as if reading a map. Clear, linear, impossible to dispute. The brokerage attempted to pivot, suggesting alternative interpretations, but she cut through each one with statute-backed precision. I took notes quietly, recording every phrase, every shift in tone. At one point, the agent exhaled sharply, the sound loud enough to distort the microphone. The conversation ended with an agreement to halt all sale discussions pending official remediation. It was the closest thing to a concession I was going to get. After the call, I placed a small note on the kitchen table for my father. "I'll be downstairs if you want to talk." I didn't stay to see whether he read it. Instead, I walked to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, letting the quiet settle around me. The house felt different, subtly rearranged, as if the pressure that had filled each room had shifted a few inches to the left. Conflict hadn't disappeared, it had just been named. And naming it made the air easier to breathe. The 3-way call felt like stepping into a narrow corridor where every word mattered. The brokerage began with another attempt at persuasion, softened tones, polite phrasing, subtle pressure hidden beneath careful language. My attorney interrupted gently but firmly, reiterating the legal necessity of disclosure and the risk of proceeding otherwise. I followed with a single sentence. "This cannot continue without addressing the contamination." No embellishment, no emotion, just fact. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reaction, recalibration. I wrote down their reply verbatim, the pen gliding in steady motion across the page. Every phrase, even the smallest, belonged in the record. By the time the call moved into procedural territory, I felt something settle inside me. A clarity that wasn't loud, just grounded. The agent's tone softened near the end. "We can give you time," he said, as if generosity had suddenly become part of the equation. My attorney corrected him. "Time isn't a favor, it's a requirement." I didn't look at the screen. I just kept noting each exchange, the ink forming clean lines that held the weight of boundaries newly drawn. The call concluded with mutual acknowledgement that no sale could move forward, not now, not under these conditions. When the screen went dark, I closed my notebook slowly, the soft thud of its cover pressing into the quiet. This wasn't victory, it was alignment. And alignment felt steadier than relief. After the call, I returned to my desk, reviewing the transcript I'd written. Every detail had its place: timestamps, paraphrases, exact quotations where needed. It looked more like a legal document than personal notes. That, in itself, felt like progress. I scanned the pages and sent a copy to my attorney with a short message. For record, the sky outside had shifted into a muted gray, the kind that made the house feel smaller and more contained. I watched the branches outside the window sway in uneven motions, their movement soft but persistent. There was something quieting about seeing the world continue without regard for my conflicts. It reminded me that truth didn't depend on attention. It simply existed. I sat for a moment in the emptied calm that followed confrontation, letting the tension in my shoulders loosen by degrees. The desk lamp reflected faintly off the metal binder clip holding the report together, a small glint of light in an otherwise subdued room. Its presence was a reminder, silent but constant, of the path I had chosen. Not easy, not smooth, but correct. I opened the folder again, reviewing the evidence not out of doubt, but out of ritual. Touchstone moments required repetition. Each chart, each threshold, each number felt like a reaffirmation. When I closed the folder, the click of the clasp felt final. I consolidated the documents from the call into a single summary, mapping out the points of agreement and the remaining uncertainties. Procedure didn't intimidate me the way it once did. It steadied me. It gave shape to something that had long existed only in emotional undertows. When I finished, I sent copies to both my personal archive and the secure drive I maintained for anything involving the land. The room was quiet except for the faint buzz of the overhead light and the soft shifting of the pages as I arranged them. There was a kind of peace in orderly paper, in knowing nothing was left floating unmoored. When I finally stood, the room felt different, lighter around the edges, as though something had exhaled. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. My reflection in the window looked older somehow, not worn, but tempered. Outside, dusk settled across the yard in a calm, deliberate descent. The boundaries had been drawn, firm, clear, and unambiguous. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe without guarding it. Whatever fractures remained between my father and me, the truth no longer wavered. It had found its footing. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves understood something had cracked beneath the surface. My father skipped dinner, leaving his plate untouched on the counter, a quiet refusal that echoed louder than any argument. The absence of his footsteps on the stairs was strange, an interruption in a rhythm I'd known for years. I sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. His silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was distance. An emotional shift had taken root, subtle but undeniable. I folded my hands and let the stillness linger, not fighting it, not filling it with noise. Some fractures didn't announce themselves loudly. They made themselves known in what no longer happened. Later, I wrote him a letter, longer than I intended, quieter than I expected. I didn't accuse or justify. I simply wrote what felt true. I cared about the land because he once cared about it. I wanted honesty because he had taught me to value it. When I finished, I stared at the page for several minutes, letting the words settle. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, knowing I wouldn't send it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some truths were meant to be understood, not delivered. Upstairs, the faint sound of his door closing drifted through the house, soft as a sigh. We were under the same roof, but not in the same place. The next morning I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The sky hung low, heavy with gray clouds, the kind that muted the edges of everything they touched. I walked the familiar path between worn gravestones, the grass brittle beneath my shoes. When I reached his marker, I knelt and rested my hand on the cool stone. "I'm doing the best I can," I whispered. The breeze shifted lightly, stirring a few dry leaves across the path. I told him about the report, about my father's silence, about the weight of choosing truth over comfort. There was no answer, of course, but the quiet felt less lonely than the silence at home. It held space instead of closing it. On the drive back, I replayed parts of the past few weeks, the moments when hesitation tugged at me, the moments when resolve anchored me. The road stretched in long, gentle curves, lined with fields that looked strangely drained of color. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly against the folder beside me. It shouldn't have comforted me, but it did. Evidence had weight, and in that weight, there was steadiness. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickered faintly, a weak electrical pulse barely holding on. The house looked the same as always, but it didn't feel the same, not anymore. Inside, I filled out the initial form for environmental intervention, pages of checkboxes, signatures, and brief explanations. The bureaucracy felt oddly soothing. Procedure didn't rely on emotion, it relied on sequence. I pressed submit, watching the small spinning icon before the confirmation appeared. Then I printed a copy for my records, stacking it neatly behind the main report. The folder was thicker now, its edges crisp and firm beneath my fingers. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a responsibility, carried with intention. That night, I slept for the first time in days without waking at every sound. Before turning off the light, I reached for the folder once more, slipping it into the drawer of my nightstand. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost gentle. It wasn't protection, it was acknowledgement. Of the truth, of the fracture, of the path forward. Outside, the porch light blinked softly, then steady. The house exhaled around me as I closed my eyes. Whatever came next, I was no longer bracing for the truth. I was standing with it. The letter from the environmental agency arrived in a plain envelope, the kind that looked almost too ordinary to carry consequence. I slid it open carefully, unfolding the document with both hands. There it was, confirmation. Site meets criteria for contamination classification. The phrasing was clinical, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Stamped, signed, logged. The state had acknowledged what the report had already shown. I read it twice, then once more, tracing each line as though the ink itself held the authority I needed to stand on. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window, lifting a thin tremor through the room. This wasn't theory anymore. It was public record. And public record changed everything. A second document outlined the remediation timeline, soil extraction phases, groundwater monitoring intervals, required inspections, and projected costs. Everything was laid out in strict columns, neat as if order could tame the problem beneath the ground. I followed the chart slowly, letting the structure guide my thoughts. It wasn't as overwhelming as I'd imagined. Hard, yes. Long, absolutely. But doable. The clarity steadied me. Each line felt like someone switching on a light in a dark room. Not enough to brighten it, but enough to show where walls stood. I sat back in my chair, the paper resting lightly on my lap, and breathed in the quiet shift of certainty. I scanned the documents immediately and forwarded them to my father in the brokerage. No commentary, just the facts. Please review page 2, I added. Nothing more. The email sent with a soft whoosh, disappearing into the digital distance between us. Within minutes, the red receipt appeared under my father's address. He didn't reply, but I knew he'd seen it. The silence that followed was heavier than usual, an acknowledgement without admission. I set my phone face down, the faint vibration of its casing against the wooden desk grounding me more than any response could have. When he finally came downstairs that afternoon, he paused in the doorway, one hand braced lightly against the frame. His eyes drifted toward the stack of printed documents on the table, scanning the bolded section headings, the official seal. He didn't reach for the papers. Instead, he asked, "So this is real?" The words were soft, almost weary. I nodded. He exhaled long and slow, the kind of breath a person releases only when something breaks, not outward, but inward. There was no anger in him this time, just a quiet collapse of denial. A small part of me ached for that, but truth didn't bend for softness. Later that evening, the brokerage called a brief meeting to discuss next steps. Their tone was clipped, subdued. The numbers had spoken louder than their persuasion ever could. Value estimates dropped sharply once contamination entered the equation. The silence on the line stretched across several seconds before anyone acknowledged it. By the end of the call, the agent finally said the thing he'd avoided from the beginning. "We'll need to reassess the plan." The understatement rested oddly in the air, but it was something. A shift. The first real one since the pressure began. I recorded the final timestamp on the meeting notes, 5:42 p.m. Then I closed the notebook, pressing my palm lightly against the cover. A small, quiet moment, but unmistakably a turning point. The land was no longer a negotiation, it was a documented hazard. And with that acknowledgement, everything that followed would move according to truth, not pressure. The evening light stretched across the floor in long muted bands. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of alignment. Not victory, not relief, just a clean line between what was known and what would come next. We sat across from each other at the dining table that evening, though it didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like weather shifting, slow and heavy. My father kept his hands clasped, knuckles pale, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere between us. "We can't sell it," I said. The words were steady, almost quiet, but they left no room for interpretation. He didn't argue, he didn't push. He blinked once, looked down at the table and nodded, barely, but enough. There was something in his posture that I hadn't seen before. Not defeat, exactly, but the beginning of acceptance. The house creaked with the cooling of evening air, the sound strangely gentle. It felt like truth had finally stopped knocking and settled into the room, choosing its place at the table with us. "Tuimai," he murmured, his voice raspy, the edges softened by fatigue rather than resistance. He stood slowly, bracing one hand against the back of the chair, as if the weight of the last few days had gathered in his bones. For a moment he looked older than I remembered, less anchored, less certain, stripped of the urgency he'd carried like armor. I didn't follow him when he walked away. Some distances are necessary even when they hurt. I gathered the documents and placed them in a single stack, aligning the edges with careful precision. The room felt larger without the tension filling every corner, quiet but not empty. A space cleared by truth, not conflict. I moved through the house picking up stray papers, old notes, coffee mugs left untouched from hurried mornings. A soft ritual of restoring order. When I reached the shared desk in the living room, I paused, touching the surface lightly before clearing away the extra clutter. I left only the essentials, a lamp, the environmental report, and the signed notices. Then I shifted the remaining piles to a smaller table in the corner. It wasn't just tidying, it was making room. Room for clarity, room for air. The wooden desk felt different once cleared, lighter, almost breathing, like a place where truth could be set down without competing noise. Later in the evening, I filled out the application for remediation support. Page after page of structured questions, each one tightening the path ahead. I double-checked each entry before hitting submit, listening to the faint click of the keyboard beneath my fingertips. The confirmation screen appeared slowly, a single sentence declaring the form received. The simplicity of it steadied me more than I expected. I printed the receipt and slid it into the folder with the others. The sound of paper meeting paper quiet, yet decisive. Standing up from the desk, I felt the room shift again, just slightly, like something heavy had lifted a few inches off the floor. Progress wasn't loud. It was incremental, steady, almost invisible until you looked back. I slipped one copy of the environmental report into my bag, letting it rest against the side pocket. Carrying it wasn't practical. It was symbolic. A quiet assurance that even away from home, I was grounded in fact. The weight of the document felt familiar now. No longer an anchor pulling me downward, but a stabilizer. Outside, the evening air was cool and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of distant cut grass. I walked the length of the driveway, letting the rhythm of steps settle the residual tension in my chest. Sometimes clarity wasn't about answers. Sometimes it was about carrying the right pieces of truth with you, literally and otherwise. That night, when I finally lay down, sleep didn't avoid me the way it had before. It came gradually, like water settling into a still bowl. Before drifting off, I reached instinctively for the nightstand drawer, touching the edge of the folder stored inside. A simple gesture, not protection, just acknowledgement. The truth was no longer something I feared waking up to. It had found its place. And in its place, it was quiet. Outside, the house softened into nighttime calm, porch boards cooling, wind brushing lightly against the siding. For the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't carry warning. It carried peace. The engineer arrived early, his truck rumbling into the driveway as the morning light stretched thin across the yard. He stepped out with a clipboard and a calm, practiced demeanor, the kind of presence that belonged to someone who dealt with difficult ground for a living. We walked the perimeter together, stopping at each flagged location on the map. He crouched, drove a small steel probe into the soil, and made a mark on his sheet before moving to the next point. His movements were efficient, deliberate, methodical. I followed a few steps behind, feeling the weight of watching someone measure damage you hadn't caused but now had to confront. The breeze carried the faint scent of dust and dried grass, stirring around us with a quiet insistence. "Conditions consistent with the report," he said, straightening up. He didn't sugarcoat it. I appreciated that. He outlined the next steps with the same steady professionalism. Subsurface excavation, groundwater sampling, deeper core extraction. His voice remained calm, even as the list grew long. "Better to be thorough now than surprised later," he said. I nodded, though a part of me felt the weight of every item, every future cost, every inch of soil that needed to be turned over. He handed me a printed timeline for the first phase, the pages crisp and cool against my palm. When I glanced at the map again, the property looked different, less like inheritance, more like responsibility laid bare. Still, responsibility had its own clarity, a hard one, but clean. After he left, I called the remediation company to schedule the first set of tests. The representative on the line was direct, efficient. "We can start excavation sampling next week," she said. I confirmed the date, wrote it into my planner, and repeated it back to ensure nothing slipped. Process soothed the parts of me still rattled by the past few weeks. Paperwork, time slots, signatures. They created structure where emotion once made things blurry. I printed the appointment confirmation and placed it in the folder, aligning the corners with quiet precision. Every piece of paper felt like a step toward something steady, even if the ground beneath us wasn't. By afternoon, I walked the property again, alone, this time carrying small orange stakes the engineer had left for marking additional sample points. The earth gave a muted crunch under my boots as I paced the edges, stopping to press each stake into the soil. There was something grounding about the act, literal and figurative. Mapping damage wasn't an admission of defeat. It was a declaration of intent. I paused near the back fence, where the grass grew patchy and thin. The sun glinted off the metal stake as I drove it into the ground. I breathed out slowly, letting the moment settle. Clarity didn't always feel like comfort, but it always felt like direction. 2 neighbors wandered over while I worked, drawn by the bright markers dotting the yard. They kept their distance at first, hands in pockets, eyes searching for cues. I walked over and explained what the next weeks would look like: inspections, soil lifts, the potential noise from machinery. They listened quietly, nodding, their shoulders easing as I spoke. "We appreciate you handling this the right way," one of them said, before heading back across the lawn. Their understanding landed gently. The tension of the past days loosened just slightly, enough to let a breath settle deeper than before. Truth had its cost, but it also had its allies. Before heading inside, I took a final photograph of the property, its current state, untouched, unexcavated, unaltered. A before to pair with whatever came next. The camera shutter clicked softly, the sound small but sure. I saved the image, time-stamped it, and slipped the phone into my pocket. As I walked back to the house, the ground felt uneven beneath my steps. Not unstable, just honest. I paused at the door, looking once more at the flagged soil behind me. The work ahead wouldn't be simple, but for the first time, the path felt aligned with something steady inside me, something I could stand on. The termination addendum from the brokerage arrived by email that morning. A clean, 2-page document, void of the pressure and posturing that had colored our earlier interactions. I read it carefully, noting the clauses dissolving any prior agreement, the absence of implied obligations, the clear acknowledgement that the sale could not continue. No dramatics, just closure. I printed the document, initialed each page, and signed the final line with steady hand. The pen felt heavier than usual, but the motion itself was light, almost effortless, as if the decision had already been made long before ink touched paper. When I set the signed copy on the table, the room felt subtly rearranged, like a knot finally loosening. My attorney confirmed receipt within minutes. "All obligations ended," her message read, followed by a list of archived items she had already stored for legal protection. I saved her email to my own archive, then leaned back in my chair, letting the clarity wash over the last remnants of tension. No more calls. No more negotiations masked as persuasion. Just an unambiguous end. Outside, a thin ray of sunlight broke through the cloud cover, catching the corner of the desk and warming the wood. The small shift of light felt like a quiet affirmation. I moved the entire B-plot folder, the emails, the threats, the early documentation, into a separate box labeled closed. The box wasn't large, but it was full, holding weeks' worth of conflict distilled into paper. The act of sealing it felt symbolic, a transition from reactive resistance to deliberate next steps. I slid the lid into place, pressing the edges until they clicked. The sound was soft, but definite, marking the end of a chapter I had never intended to write. I placed the box on the shelf behind me, out of reach, but not out of record. Closure didn't erase history, it simply organized it. My father didn't come downstairs for the signing. The absence stung more than I expected. Still, I picked up the addendum and signed it alone at the dining table, the wood cool beneath my forearm. I paused after finishing the signature, letting the ink settle as a thin reflection of light shone along its surface. There was no anger in the empty chair beside me, just a quiet acknowledgement that some distances could not be bridged by paperwork or truth. Not immediately, anyway. I placed the completed form beside the folder and pushed in the chair, the scraped whisper of wood against tile sounding almost final. When I texted him, The documents are on the table. I didn't expect a reply, and none came. The message marked the end of our participation in the sale, but not the end of what lay between us. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, watching the afternoon light slip across the refrigerator door, slowly fading into the darker half of the room. The quiet felt less like conflict now, and more like waiting. An undefined space between fracture and repair. I didn't fill it with thought. I simply let it exist. Later, I stood by the window, looking out at the yard marked with survey flags, the faint rust-colored soil peeking through the grass. The evening breeze brushed lightly against the pane, creating a subtle vibration beneath my hand. The B plot was closed, cleanly, officially, and without ambiguity. What remained was the work ahead, the remediation, the slow, careful rebuilding of something that had fractured far deeper than soil. As the light dimmed, I took a long breath, letting the air settle into my lungs with deliberate slowness. Closure, I realized, wasn't a finish. It was a clearing. I placed the main folder, the report, the correspondence, the state notices, on the top shelf of the study. The shelf sat just above eye level, forcing me to stretch slightly as I settled the documents into place. The weight left my hands with a soft thud, the kind that didn't echo but landed cleanly. For a moment, I kept my fingertips on the spine of the folder, feeling the faint texture of the cardboard beneath them. It wasn't reverence, just acknowledgement. A recognition that the weight I had carried for weeks was no longer something I needed to keep within reach. I stepped back, taking in the cleared desk below. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar, to see the space empty. Emptiness, I realized, wasn't a void. It was room. I cleared the last stack of loose papers, sliding them into a small drawer. Only the framed photograph of my grandfather remained on the desk, angled slightly toward the window where morning light brushed the glass. The room felt lighter, quieter, cleaner. I ran a cloth across the surface, the wood warming under the slow motion of my hand. For weeks, the desk had held urgency, tension, the sharp edges of conflict. Now it held stillness. A stillness shaped not by avoidance, but by decisions that had found their endpoint. I placed the cloth aside and let the silence stand without resistance, its presence calm, almost sheltering. Outside, I walked along the fence line bordering the property. The grass shifted under my shoes, bending with a soft rustle as the wind carried through the yard. I paused near the southern side, where the ground sloped gently downward, an area I had crossed countless times without thinking. Today it felt different, not heavier but truer. The flags marking future remediation points fluttered quietly, their thin plastic edges catching the breeze in small, erratic motions. I followed their movement with my eyes, tracing the slow choreography of damage mapped and acknowledged. A quiet promise formed inside me. One step at a time, one layer at a time. Care would follow truth. A young neighbor's daughter stopped at the end of the driveway, holding a small bike with chipped blue paint. "Are you going to plant grass again?" she asked. Her voice carried a simplicity that felt disarming, an honesty free from the adult weight of consequence. "When the land's healthy," I said. She nodded, accepting the answer without hesitation, then pedaled off with a wobbling determination. I watched her disappear around the corner, feeling the faintest lift in my chest. Children didn't ask for explanations. They asked for futures. And the future of this place would have to be rebuilt with patience, not shortcuts. Back inside, I drafted short emails to the engineer, the remediation coordinator, and my attorney. Nothing elaborate, just brief thank yous and confirmations for the next steps. I pressed send, one message at a time, the quiet click of each confirmation grounding me. In the accumulation of these small exchanges, I felt something subtle but real. Trust rebuilt, piece by piece, with the people who had stood steady when everything else wavered. The inbox dimmed back to stillness. I leaned back and let the moments settle in my chest. Sometimes the softest tasks carried the most meaning. That evening, I stepped outside one last time and turned off the porch light, letting the darkness settle naturally over the yard without interference. The house behind me shifted into its nighttime cadence. Boards cooling, distant pipes murmuring, faint shadows stretching across familiar corners. I stood quietly on the porch, letting the air touch my face, cool and even. Distance still lived between my father and me, but it no longer felt like a threat. Just space, waiting for whatever time allowed next. The night held its steady quiet, unbroken, unburdened, and for the first time in a long while, I let it stand exactly as it was. The remediation crew arrived just after sunrise, their equipment humming in low, steady tones that rolled across the yard like a measured heartbeat. I stood on the porch with a mug of warm coffee, watching as they unloaded tools, stakes, and the small excavator that would cut into the soil. It didn't feel intrusive. It felt expected, like the world was finally catching up to what had already been written in reports and records. The foreman nodded at me, offering a simple, respectful greeting before turning back to the crew. Behind him, the engine rumbled to life, soft at first, then full-bodied, the sound spreading through the morning air. For the first time, I wasn't bracing. I was witnessing. My father appeared at the doorway a few minutes later. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside me, neither close nor distant, his gaze fixed on the workers marking off the first cut of ground. "I didn't think it would be this much," he murmured. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only recognition. I nodded, not pushing for more. He rubbed his jaw, exhaling through his nose, a gesture I'd known all my life. But today it carried something softer, something unarmored. He watched the crew quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, like a weight shifting in place rather than being lifted. We walked the yard together, slowly, without a plan, while the workers began the first shallow excavation. The soil lifted in clean, measured lines, each cut revealing layers beneath the surface. Dry earth, darker soil, older sediment. My father paused near one of the stakes, crouching just enough to brush his hand along the broken ground. He didn't speak, but the gesture carried the weight of memory. Years of tending, walking, arguing, returning. I stood a few steps away, giving him the space he needed. He finally straightened and looked toward me. "It's good you caught it," he said quietly. Not an apology, not a surrender, but truth, spoken plainly for the first time. I sat at the small patio table while the crew continued their work, flipping through the remediation forms once more. The pages fluttered lightly in the breeze, corners lifting as if reaching toward the open air. Every signature, every timestamp, every recorded detail aligned in a clean structure that felt earned. The sound of soil being lifted, soft, granular, rhythmic, became a kind of grounding presence, not destructive, restorative. When I looked up again, the excavator paused, its bucket suspended over the trench, holding a scoop of darkened earth that would be sampled before removal. The process was slow, deliberate, but progress often was. By late afternoon, the yard had transformed. Patches of exposed soil where grass once grew, neat piles of earth under tarps, flags relocated to new lines. It didn't look ruined. It looked tended to, corrected. My father came down the walkway holding 2 glasses of iced tea, offering one to me without ceremony. We sat together in the shade, not talking about the past weeks, not forcing meaning onto the moment, just sitting. Every so often he glanced at the workers with a kind of reluctant respect, as though seeing the land through a different lens for the first time. The quiet between us felt different now, less like distance, more like space. As the sun lowered, the crew packed their equipment, promising updates by morning. The yard settled into a raw but honest stillness, the exposed soil catching the last of the light in muted gold streaks. I stood at the edge of the porch, letting the air cool against my skin. My father joined me again, hands in his pockets, the lines on his face softer than they had been in weeks. "We'll get it right," he said. A simple sentence, measured, grounded. I nodded. Not everything had been repaired, but the ground beneath us was no longer shifting. It was clear. And clarity, I realized, was its own kind of healing. In the end, the land didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt honest. Raw in places, repaired in others, still healing in the silent corners where memory lingered. The flags, the soil cuts, the slow machinery. All of it became part of a landscape finally telling the truth it had carried for years. My father and I never had a dramatic reconciliation. What we had was quieter. Shared tea on the porch, a nod of understanding when the crew arrived each morning, a slow thaw in the distance that had settled between us. Sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's just two people standing on the same ground again, even if they don't say everything out loud. The land will recover. So will we. Slowly, deliberately, without shortcuts. And as I watched the last of the daylight stretch across the newly treated soil, I understood something simple. Telling the truth doesn't ruin what you love. It protects it, even when it hurts. Thank you for staying with this story. If it touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.